All right, welcome back. I hope you're having an amazing show so far. Our next panel is titled AI for Diagnostics. Please join me in welcoming our panelists to the virtual stage. And I'll hand it over to Hamilton, our moderator.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us for this panel on AI and diagnostics. We'll just do a quick round of introductions. I'll start off with myself. I'm Hamilton Baker. I am a pediatric cardiologist by trade at the Medical University of South Carolina. I have had a long interest in machine learning and AI in medicine, and am director of the MUSC AI Hub. I'll pass it over to Yin to introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Yin Aphinyanaphongs. I am a physician scientist, and I'm the director of operational data science and machine learning at NYU Langone Health. Operationally and academically, I run a lab that thinks about how barriers around translation of AI models into clinical practice.
Great. And Raj, you mind doing a quick self-introduction?
Yeah, so nice to meet you, Hamilton and Yen, and thank you to AI4 for allowing us to take part in this meeting. My name is Raj Singh. I work as a pathologist. I've been doing pathology for the last 25 years, and I've worked at multiple institutions like Sinai, Northwell, and have been helping these institutions in implementing AI solutions and workflow solutions for digital pathology and radiology. And in the process, I've also built a startup company called PathPresenter, which is currently working with 23 institutions in the US, as well as some abroad in Japan, Singapore, and Australia to implement workflow solutions in pathology, radiology, and also integrate AI models.
Great. Well, I am honored to moderate this panel, and sounds like we have some pretty significant expertise here. So let's get started with the first question. I'll read it aloud for everyone. People in healthcare are certainly talking about AI, yet the true number of models in production across healthcare companies varies widely. How prevalent is AI in healthcare? Pretty general question there, so I think we can take it in an awful lot of directions. Raj, do you mind taking a stab at this one?
Yeah, so if you look at AI in healthcare, specifically related to medical imaging, where I'm really focused on, there's a lot of interest currently because you can see that a lot of data being generated in multiple big academic centers, organizations. The computing power has significantly gone up in the last couple of years with all these big companies like NVIDIA creating a lot of computing power that can be used. And so with a lot of data, a lot of computing power and great AI models that are coming out of these big companies like Google and Facebook, there's a lot of hype now that really AI can come into the center space of healthcare, because you need a lot of data, and with the cloud storage is going significantly down, the ability to share this data across multiple researchers. Like if Yen wants to use data that is only available at NYU, his AI models are not going to be very, very great because they will be good for publishing, and they're using a very small data set. But now with all the technology, he can use data not only from NYU, but from other institutions in the US, even from abroad, based on the cloud computing and cloud storage. So the AI models that are coming in the last 1 or 2 years have become very powerful. So yes, they're still not in the clinical space, they are still in the research space, most of them. But if you look at pathology, there is currently FDA just approved a model for prostate cancer, just I think two to 3 months ago, that came out of Sloan Kettering and Page. That was actually the first pathology model that was approved for use in clinical practice. There are a lot of radiology models that have already been approved, and I think in the next, you will see a lot of AI models coming into practice related to radiology, pathology. And these are not only for making a diagnosis. We are also trying to use these images to see if we can help the clinician predict the disease in a better way, decide treatments in a better way, do prognostication in a better way. So a lot coming in the next couple of years. But yes, currently everything is more in a research mode.
Yeah, I definitely have to agree with that. And I think, you're spot on with a lot of it being in image diagnostics as opposed to more clinical decision support. But Jin, I want to give you a chance to weigh in here. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I think, so when I talk to my students, right, I think, there's some core barriers. It's sort of what got me into this ball game to begin with, is like some of you guys, I was a researcher for probably 4 or 5 years, and I just kept on churning out these papers around like, look, machine learning can do this, it can do that. It's so awesome. It's great. It's great. It's great. But then, I kind of looked over the fence. I was like, I've been in this game, since I started my PhD was like, 15 years, but yet, nothing was translating. No one was using these things, right? And I think to really understand why that is, we have to understand, the barriers, right, for what's actually preventing these models to getting in production. And I think they're not just technical barriers, right? There's also social barriers, and just to name off a couple of things, I think some of the biggest factors is we just don't have proven evidence for a lot of things that these AI models actually make a difference, either in clinically or sometimes even operationally, and it's really hard to persuade someone to adopt a model when you can't really say whether it's going to have the intended downstream effect. But I don't think that's so different than where we were with drug products, say 50 years ago or 60 years ago, right? When, people were kicking out drug products and, there was evidence that was starting to form around how the FDA could play a role in helping us understand that there's enough studies, right, to make the use of this AI model valuable. And I think the most mature case of this is in ophthalmology and diabetic retinopathy. So I mean, there's a CPT code now for diabetic retinopathy, and adoption in the U.S. is a little bit tepid, probably on that part, but internationally, there's really solid adoption, both in the UK and other countries, because the use cases there are a little bit more sort of less expert driven, right? And so, in places where you don't have a lot of ophthalmologists, this AI solution is perfect. And the evidence is very robust, right? If you look at the evidence trail. So I think I'm hoping that over time, right, a lot of these new things that we consider new today will start generating evidence that shows that it works, that shows it makes a difference. And then people will start paying attention and thinking about, okay, how can we adopt this and how can we use it, for our own data. So I'm really waiting for that moment, and I think it's going to happen, but it's going to be expensive because real trials are not cheap to do. But I think it's definitely the direction that we're heading toward.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I had some conversations with folks here. The implementation science part is really coming to a head, and I think that's an incredibly important area for the next few years. But there's a theory out there that deploying these in silent mode in the background, either clinical decision support or image-based diagnostic, that will somewhat ease trials, right? Because it won't necessarily expose people to the same amount of risk that, say, a drug would,
Right.
So I'm very hopeful that will augment the implementation of some of these models and move them from research into actual clinical workflows. But from the academic perspective, one thing that I've been a bit frustrated with is the lack of translation of a lot. There is certainly no shortage of articles in the last 4 or 5 years on pretty impressive performance of models, albeit in a defined population. And you can question not only how they evaluated the model, but is it generalizable? But still, I think it's a bit of a mismatch for motivation, right? Because researchers, once they get those works published, et cetera, a number of projects do seem to stop there, and they look to others to pick that up and move it into clinical workflows and translation. And I wonder, to a certain degree, if more participation of clinicians, not necessarily very research focused clinicians, but clinician champions from the very beginning of some of these projects would help continue that process, because you'll have the buy-in from a very early point in moving it into the clinical realm. I don't know if either of you have any thoughts on that.
Like having champions there, like for anything that you need, any new thing that you want to start in the institution or in an academic place or in an organization, it's always better to pick champions first, because you cannot convince the entire faculty to like go on to something that there is so many questions about, like, because the most important thing is like everybody wants some kind of explainability or interpretability. Why is this model like showing something that can be done in this way basically, and that explainability is still not there. So you cannot convince all the faculty to like come on board immediately. So having like what you said, the only way to go about this is initially finding those champions, a couple of people that believe in this, and then like start with them, and then once, and then like what you call is like the ball rolling down a snow hill, and then it will become eventually a big ball that everybody will agree on basically.
Yeah. No, I think a lot of this comes down to like a terminology and education, right? Like when you think about drug products, right? Like, you can go to any physician and talk about a drug product with them and talk about, the evidence behind it, and people pretty much instantly understand it. If you explain to them, this is what the drug, this is what it does, this is a little bit how it works. Here's a study that shows you that, if you give it, you're going to decrease, a systolic, of high blood pressure by, 13 points. People get it, right? And then they think about, okay, great. And what are the contraindications, right? They actually have a language where they can engage with this. And I think on the AI side, we're still in the beginning phases where you still need experts, right, who can talk this language, who can, sort of sell it, right, to other people, because we don't have a language yet that, you can just go to sort of a random physician, right, and give them this information, and they can look at it and be like, oh yeah, I'm totally going to use this, And some of it, is, yeah, and I think we'll get better at this over time, like here at NYU in our medical school, we have a whole track now, of 4 to 6 lectures. They're just focused exclusively on informatics and AI and other things, because we're trying to give people this ability to understand, the vernacular. And so when you go up someplace and you spew it out, right, people are like, oh yeah, okay, I totally get it, and I understand where I would use this thing. And so yeah, I think, and that's just kind of another barrier, to adoption, but I think we're getting there over time.
Yeah, I can like, there is one definite, like in the last 6 to 12 months, especially after COVID, people have started like listening to a lot of like getting themselves tuned to like, maybe there are solutions that can help us treat the patient or make a diagnosis in a much better way. And I've seen the change coming in my organization that I've worked in the meetings that I go to. Like the questions are now changing. Previously, like the question that I used to hear, is it even ethical to do this? Because you are using data that is coming from a small group basically. And a very interesting question that I heard in the last meeting is, now we know that we have these AI models that work. There are multiple publications that show that these AI models that work. So the very interesting question that I heard is it ethical now not to use an AI model when I know that it can help my patient? So it's a complete turnaround of the question. Like first it was it ethical even to use AI, but now it was like, is it ethical not to use AI if I know it can help my patient? So it's a completely turnaround of the question.
Yeah, all those are excellent points. I think a lot of that does come back around to the educational barrier of, it's hard enough for physicians to evaluate p-values and standard statistical evaluations of journal articles. When you have folks playing around with all of the different evaluative methods of an ML model, you can make it look really good, even when it is not so great. So I think that's, education is key there. And that's part of, at our institution, the hub that I lead at Medical University of South Carolina, we partnered with Clemson University. So now it's the Clemson University and MUSC AI Hub. And what that's allowed us to do is tap into their huge reservoir in their computer science school and all their other academic divisions, departments, and schools. And we're running a seminar series at our institution that has had pretty good, show rate. We run it every other week, and we do straightforward machine learning tutorials, those sorts of things. People present the research. Now, I know that's pretty ubiquitous online, but I think when it's coming from your own institution, from somebody gains a little bit more traction there. So we hope that will really, methods like that will really start to to open up the educational thing. But great conversation. I think it's time for us to move on to one more question, or we won't even get through two of these. So let's move on to the next one. Question number 2 is, tell a story about a successful or unsuccessful use case you are privy to around AI in healthcare. What was the situation and how did it go?
How do you start, Hamilton?
Well, okay, sure. Yeah. Well, I think part of being the moderator is I get to pick, but I'll pick on myself. That's fair. So, one example, and this was some years ago, and I think this is probably part of the reason that it was not necessarily so successful, but early on when one of the big targets, and it still is sepsis identification, right? So a sepsis model. And there's a lot of them out there. There's been great work done, but that's still one that has had difficulty with implementation. Even the model within Epic, there was a recent publication out of University of Michigan, I believe, that highlighted some of the difficulties, but we tried to sort of create our own at MUSC. And it was, it performed reasonably well, but I believe one of the big reasons we were never able to really move it forward was implementation science. There was a few clinicians involved from the beginning, but there really wasn't buy-in across the board. There was little education about what it is. And this was long enough ago that people, I think, were even less comfortable with machine learning models. I think we know an awful lot more, and we're going to be much more careful and are more careful about this process because, I'm still a practicing clinician. And so it is really near and dear to my heart that, workflows, you just can't mess with a clinician's workflow, or they are going to, they're going to dig their heels in, at least some of them will. And so you might have some champions, but it's converting the ones outside the champions that are the real difficulty. So I don't know if either of you have had similar experiences.
Yeah. We've tried to tackle sepsis too. For us, it came down to this idea of value. And what we found was that usually when people build these sepsis models, they include things like orders, and they really do the the classic kitchen sink approach, right, to building these models. And what we found is that, well, the model wasn't always giving the physician something they didn't know already. For example, you'd see, the model would see that now the clinicians ordered a lactate, and so the risk score would go up 20 points. Well, of course it will, because the physician has the pretest probability, right? The pretest chances that the patient has sepsis is now higher because the physician has decided to order a lactate. And so in that sense, we just found that if you define value as telling you something that you didn't know already, I think that's where we just weren't getting enough, in a sense, surprises, right? We weren't getting enough value add to sort of move over to this other, to try to do this whole other thing, right? Because we weren't seeing that value. And so in some of our more recent projects, right, we're trying to push the boundaries toward what we call like superhuman tasks, right? What are some things that the computer can do in a pre-sepsis environment where it can surprise you, right? If there are data feeds, that tell you something that you didn't know before, right, and can put it on your radar. And I think that's where people will now say, what, this is totally a compliment to the work I do, in terms of analyzing the data and trying to come up with what's going to happen next, rather than just this sort of, somewhat, sort of a supplement that's just telling you, hey, did you know, and it just, at some point you're like, okay, I know, you don't need to tell me that. So like you're saying, some of the, translational barriers, the implementation science, right? This is all part of that. And I think, when we get to the point of the machines doing surprising and superhuman things that humans alone can't do, right? Or you need a lot of expertise to do it, right? That's when it gets interesting, right? That's when we're adding value. That's when we're actually getting people to adopt these things. What do you think?
Yeah, so when you look at the imaging algorithms, like we have come across so many of them that we have tested out, but they do not work as well as they were like supposed to work. And the main reason that we have seen is because, like, one, the images that are being used for training these algorithms, they're coming from a single source. And there is not like, and in pathology, like the other problem in pathology, the main problem is like we have multiple file formats being generated by multiple kinds of scanners that are coming from multiple companies. And because we have these different file formats, like algorithms that are built based on a single file format don't work with the algorithm with the different file format. So one is because there are so many different file formats in medical imaging. And secondly, that the data sets are very small and they are not diverse enough, is the main reason we are finding that whenever we get an algorithm, we like try to work with that algorithm in a different environment, it doesn't work that well. So for the solution that we're trying to find to this is some kind of a federated learning model where you could like work with multiple different organizations, not only in one country, but across continents, where the data sets could be used without even leaving the firewalls of the institution. So we are now trying to implement like federated learning networks for testing and validating of AI algorithms, so that we can get a diverse kind of data set coming from multiple scanners, multiple populations, and then trying to test and validate these algorithms or build these algorithms so that we can have something that works across continents, across populations, and is not only good for a publication.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. There I know there are startups looking at designing federated learning type, programs, and basically where, the very interesting thing is if you're going to get a lot of academic or other institutions involved, how do you reimburse, right? So everybody wants to benefit from the model that's being created, and they participate in training. And then I think it's there's a company that does this in radiology, looking at making sure that your participation, you get remunerated in a adequate fashion. I think that's really going to motivate folks to give that data into those large pools so that we can start to create much more generalizable models. Interesting discussion. Any last thoughts before we move on to the next question?
Well, I do have to talk about successful and unsuccessful use cases.
Oh, sorry, you go right ahead.
I do have to tell this story for like a couple minutes because I think it's a really like just our, I guess the NYU approach, to this kind of data science. So we run a really agile shop. So when COVID sort of took off, because of the operational nature of my team, operations comes to us, and says, hey, look, we need some help. What can you help us do? How can analytics help, us manage COVID better? So we got the request on a Friday, and because of a lot of the infrastructure we've invested in, by Sunday we had built probably close to 13 models, right, for COVID. So things like, can you identify whether a test will be positive, right, based on the incoming clinical data only? And that was because there was a time when just tests weren't available, right? And so people were, you just needed to you had to determine whether you thought someone might have COVID or not. Can you predict adverse events, right? If you're in the ED, can you predict, whether you should admit this patient or send them home? And so we had a whole slew of things that we built, and over time, right, we talked to our clinicians, trying to figure out what we wanted to do. They looked at the adverse event model and were like, well, the thing is that at this point, there's no interventions that we know of, right? And so even if you told us that someone was going to be sick, what could we do, right? We would still manage them the same way. So eventually, we triangulated on what we call a favorable outcome model. So we published this in Nature Medicine, so you can just Google, MPJ Digital Medicine, and you can just Google my name if you want to try to find that. And and it was really focused around, okay, how do we know these patients are well enough to go to a lower level of care? And that was super important for us because, and what New York hit that first surge, right? And so we were enlisting clinicians all across the institution who weren't necessarily hospitalists, right, to take care of these patients. And, that's a tough situation, right? When you're trying to take care of a patient population you don't really take care of. And so the idea was like, look, can we augment their decision-making, right? To make them feel confident that, this patient's actually okay. They can go to a lower level of care. So we defined that whole model. It was awesome. And even more interesting is we went into clinical trial in the 3rd month. So we started a randomized controlled trial. At that time, the first surge was over, and then we had to wait because clinical trials take a ton of data. We had to wait to accrue almost 1,000 patients. So that took us almost 9 months, right? And so, so the 9 months comes along, and we haven't been looking at any of our data, even though we wanted to cheat, and go look because we were really interested to see what happens. And we analyze our data, and turns out there was no effect in the model, right? And we published this too, and so it was a bummer because we were hoping to get our Lancet paper, our New England Journal paper, front and center, but we didn't. That's okay. But in our retrospective, I think we learned a couple things that are just super valuable lessons, about how to do these things. And one of the most important was we just thought our education was awesome, and it just wasn't. And so retrospectively, when we looked at the adoption of the model, right, and because in our EHR, there's a specific thing you have to do to start seeing, right, this prediction, right? And we saw that there was a very small percentage of clinicians that actually, added what we call this column to their list, so this data was actually available. And that's a bummer because it's not, the null result wasn't because they knew about it, right? And that they just thought it was useless. It was because we just couldn't get adoption. We just didn't have enough adoption for people actually using this thing. And so what we've done now is we have all kinds of what we call adoption metrics. So when we deploy things, we know who adds, we know who's interacting with it. And if we don't get enough, right, it's sort of augmenting, right, to make sure that we get enough. And in the drug trial sense, right, it would be the equivalent of sort of, not of sort of low adherence, right? You enroll a bunch of people in the trial, but then you realize that 80% of your people just didn't really take the drug, right? And of course, you're going to get a null result, right? And so in that sense, I think that was a huge, sort of learning point, which retrospectively seems really obvious, when we think about it. But now that we actually have, the reporting metrics, we can follow along and actually see what's happening, who's using it, how much time are they spending with it. And I think those are all important metrics so that we can say, look, that wasn't a problem. The trial was either successful or it failed because, they either loved it or they didn't. That's my story. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great story, actually. I'm glad you shared that before we moved on, because it is a perfect example of something that those pains that we all have felt. And it makes me wonder. It seems like we keep coming back to education and adoption and implementation science. Are we going to have to start buying people lunch and handing out pens to get them to use our models?
That was a story with EHRs, right? When EHRs first came out, that was the Vanderbilt model when I was there. It was all like, well, we have these pizza Fridays, right? We'll just bring free pizza. And then people would pile in, and they would just take that opportunity to just tell people how awesome the EHR was and how to use it and all that kind of stuff. And
the power of pizza.
Yes, the power of pizza.
Well, free pizza, I should say.
Right.
Free pizza is much more power.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that was a great discussion. An excellent question. I think it's time to move on to the next one. All right. What are some examples of impactful ways that AI can enhance outcomes in diagnostics? The more, the merrier.
I can take that first. In diagnostics, what we have realized is for the AI to be really powerful, when you're using imaging, it is not like making the pathologist or the radiologist more powerful. If you can find a way to actually help the oncologist in a way that they can treat the patients in a better way or in a faster way or something that will help the patient, that is where the AI really becomes powerful. And so what the thing that has become center stage is how do you use AI in medical images to predict some kind of a biomarker that can predict what would be the prognosis of the patient, what would be the treatment that would be most effective for the patient. And I think that is where the whole power of AI is. So if we can use these images, not to make a faster diagnosis, because I don't think as a cardiologist or as a physician, you want a faster diagnosis. What you want to know is there something from that image that can help me predict something that will help my patient. And I think that is where either predicting the underlying treatment through some biomarker that can be predicted from the image because of some pattern that the AI is recognizing, or what kind of treatment is going to be more effective for this patient. Let's say it's a patient of lung cancer. Can a digital slide or a radiology image predict what kind of underlying mutation does this lung cancer have? And based on that mutation, can we predict what kind of treatment is going to be very useful for this patient? So rather than the patient going through this expensive molecular testing where the tissue is sent to some other place and they have to wait for 3 weeks to get the underlying molecular testing, if it is possible to predict it from the medical image like a pathology slide or a radiology image, that would make it very powerful basically. And I think that is where the whole power of medical imaging AI is going to come into.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, go ahead, Hamilton.
No, you go ahead.
I already did my spiel. I talked big time, so you talk a little bit.
Well, the question being impactful ways that AI can enhance outcomes. I think the real word there is outcomes, right? And we've certainly had a large number of excellent predictive scores, especially in cardiovascular health, for a very long time. And I think one question I get a lot from folks is, so we take our predictive abilities for a patient suffering from something, up 2%. Is it really going to make the patient take their medication more? Is it really going to get them to adhere? Is it going to get them to change their lifestyle and those sorts of things? And so, when I think about this question, and it's not directly related to diagnostics, but about implementing AI in other ways to help the patient understand what some of those predictive scores mean and use it, in a way, even employing chatbots and so forth to interact with the patient in different ways. Because I think when you look at AI's ability to truly enhance outcomes, one, it can make the physician more powerful, right? And make you better at what you do. But does that transition to the patient, right? Just because I make a better diagnosis doesn't mean my patient takes their medications. And so that's where I really see, AI enhancing not only from diagnosis, but moving on. Now, this question was supposed to be more about diagnostics, and you guys asked me to talk, so I'm just going to keep talking. But one thing I find really interesting too is, Raj, as a pathologist, you've seen some pretty phenomenal models. It's an image-based subspecialty. Cardiology is kind of both, right? We have echo and lots of images, MRI, et cetera. At the same time, we have a lot of clinical decision support. Not that that isn't in pathology, but I think it's a bit more sophisticated and bigger part of what we do in cardiology. And so I think one of the more difficult areas in diagnostics for AI is that clinical decision support tools, because there's just so many more subtleties to the diagnostic process when you're really not just looking at images, et cetera, when you're trying to put a lot of pieces together. So I think that when models can help physicians decrease practice variation in these complex areas, because in my mind, that's really where practice variation comes in and probably hurts outcomes, right? Because nobody knows the exact best thing to do. I think that's where a AI model telling you what the best thing to do is in a way, in little nudges that are helping you, could really have a significant effect on outcomes.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, this idea of reducing variability, right? So when you think about it, like, what's the computer good at, right? One thing is it's good at doing something fast, right? So like you get a chest x-ray, you want to upgrade that so the radiologist sees it so that he can diagnose a pneumothoraces, and then that way you can start treatment, right? And so that's one example of like, how you can get an outcome, much faster, right? Because that's just what it's good at, is doing it fast. Now, it's not replacing the human, right? And that's very important. But what it is upgrading it, to the top of their list. So they look at it first, right? Because it's definitely, something that needs to be looked at. And I think the second is this sort of deterministic nature, right, of the algorithm, which you're pointing out. right? You put in some inputs, it's always going to get you the same output, right? Whereas with humans, I give you an input, I give Rajendra an input, I give me an input, and we're going to produce 3 different things, right? And that can be a problem, right?
Yeah.
Because now we're operating, with the same information, but we're doing different things with it.
Yeah.
And I think that idea of, the deterministic nature of these algorithms are really helpful because it levels the playing field in a sense, right? So that everybody isn't operating on trying to assess a score, but they get a score, right? And so, for example, we have here a 2-month mortality model, which drives conversations around advanced care planning conversations, right? And so physicians are pretty rough at this. If you do, there's something called the mandatory surprise question, which is asking the question, do you think this patient, will die in the next 6 months? And when people try to do it, when doctors try to do it, they're about 50% sensitive and 50% positive value, right? Which means that out of all the patients that die in 2 months, physicians are right about 50% of the time. But then when a physician does make a call as to whether they think that patient's going to die in the next 2 months, right, they're right 50% of the time. And so it's a little bit not exactly apples to apples because the mandatory price question is 6 months and we're 2 months. But the value of that model is that now I don't have to train every clinician what it means for a patient to be sick, right? And the model just spits out a percentage. We set the positive predictive value at 75%. When we say that, look, this patient looks like they're at risk, we say they're at 75% risk. And now, we've done some user studies where people like the idea of going into a room, right, and having this alert fire, and they know the context now, right, of this interaction with this patient. And that's really great because the hospitalists, they haven't met this patient before, and they have that surveillance to, for them to assess this in their thinking and go into that room and be like, you know what, we're going to really figure out how to, help you, just live the life you want to live, right? And I think that's super powerful, and that reduction of variability is super important. And I think the last point is real quick is that it will be impactful if we're doing superhuman things with them. Like Rajendra was pointing out, like, look, if you could just look at an MRI and you can get the, radiogenomic, you can get the genomic profile of that cancer, right? Just by looking at the MRI, boom, that's a superhuman task, right? That you get this information for free, basically, right? And then now you can drive an outcome, right? Now you can do things that would have taken a biopsy or other things. And so I think that's where, these things will get really interesting, is when they start doing superhuman things. But then that's also where we as humans get uncomfortable, because now it's doing something that, we don't necessarily understand.
Yeah.
And I think that can be hard.
Yeah. There's a saying that that has come about. It's time for us to stop worrying about computers taking our jobs and start thinking about how they can make us smarter. Yeah, I really truly believe that there is this arms race between physicians and models just needs to go away, and not just physicians. I mean, all clinicians. It is really about the two providing the best possible care. And, I really feel like sentiment is moving in that direction. All right, well, I think we only have about 5 minutes left. So I was actually going to ask Patrika if it would be possible for us to move to the last question, because it's kind of one of those future questions. And I like to end panels on those. I think it's interesting. So the last question is, what is the absolute cutting edge you expect to see when it comes to AI in diagnostics over the next 5 years?
Yep, I can go again first, no problem. Like the cutting edge, I think, is going to be when you're going to use multiple modalities to help the patient out. So it's like, what is the information that is coming from the EHR? What is the information that is coming from a radiology image? What is the information that is coming from a pathology image? What is the information coming from genomics? And like when you have this multimodality information coming to a central AI model and predicting something will be much, much more powerful than what we currently have today. And I think that is what the direction that we are trying to move towards, where we can get information from every modality that the patient is being exposed to. And then how do you like integrate all this data and produce some kind of an AI model that will predict something much, much better. That is, I think, where this whole thing is heading towards, actually.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think multimodal is sort of the synthesis of disparate pieces of data in a way that as a clinician, you can take advantage of the breadth of the data that's available to a machine to help augment your decision with all the other factors that are important, are going to be, super powerful. I think, these superhuman tasks are going to become even more apparent as we move forward. Where it's not just augmentation, but it's actually telling you things that, you want to know to help drive care. And I think that'll be an increasingly, sort of cutting edge, when it comes to diagnostics. And I think there's going to be capabilities that the machines are going to do, not just in specific tasks, but things like remote patient monitoring, right? You're going to have new modalities, the new different kinds of data that we haven't typically had available in the past, where we're going to have huge runs of, iWatch data, other things, right? And we're going to be able to use that to say, look, here's some things that we've noticed, right, about what, has been coming with this remote patient monitoring data. And I think that's what it's going to look like in the future. And all of that's going to somehow be driven in some ways always by AI, because it's just too much data, for a clinician to be able to sort of analyze.
Yeah, those are both, and I'm basically going to repeat what you guys said, but in a different way, because I feel very much the same way. But I feel like this huge breadth of data, omics of so many different kinds, sort of taking literally the whole phenome into account. And that will allow truly superhuman predictive abilities. And, to kind of bring it down to a more granular example, I think being able to catch cancers in earlier stages is really something we may very well see in the next 5 years through a number of different methods. And I think that is a real powerful place to intervene, and that will build the confidence in AI. I don't know if that's going to happen in 5 years. That's a pretty tall order, but I think we're really going to see it. There is already a increase in focus on large breadth of data, omics, et cetera. But I think we're going to start to see some, as you were mentioning, Yin and Raj, some real hard examples of just undeniably superhuman capabilities. And when those, once those are appreciated, I think that will do a lot for implementation, because it'll allow us to undeniably do so much more for our patients. And going back to what Raj said earlier, is it ethical to not use these capabilities? I don't know that we're going to reach that in 5 years, but I think we're going to start to scratch the surface of that process.
Yeah.
Yep, yeah.
Yeah. And I think, there's still a ton of work to be done on the regulatory side. There's still a ton of work to be done on the ethics side. There's still a ton of work to be done, like you said, on the implementation science side. And I think, in the next 5 years, we're going to continue to move forward, right? And whether we hit 10 years, I mean, hard, whether it's going to take 10 or 15, I don't know, it's hard to say. But I know that there are core investments being made today that allow us to move in every one of those directions, because they all need to happen, figured out simultaneously.
Yeah. The one question that keeps coming very frequently in multiple meetings is who's responsible? So if something goes wrong, let's say I'm going to use an AI model, and if something goes wrong, am I responsible? Is my organization responsible? Is the developer responsible? That is a very big question that comes up very frequently in a lot of meetings that I speak at, actually, because nobody knows the answer to that currently. Actually. That has to be sorted out also. Yeah.
We could start right now and talk a whole nother hour about ethics and legal issues. I hope that's something that we'll see in the future. I'd love to be a part of that panel, and because I think that is just a fascinating area, and I'm seeing a lot more publications on it. And we're looking towards integrating some of that work into grants that we apply for. Are we really focusing on an ethically responsible approach to creation of AI-empowered devices as well as models? But I think we're out of time, unfortunately. This has been a fantastic conversation. I could keep talking with the two of you for another hour about all this. But I think it's time to wrap it up. So I will let Patrika take back over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamilton, for doing this.
Thank you to both of you.
Thanks, Rajendra.
This has been incredible. And yes, I know I could listen for another hour. So thank you all for sharing, and a special thank you to Hamilton for moderating and keeping us on track. This has been incredible. And I know this virtual audience is going wild with virtual applause.
Thank you.
We appreciate your time today. And for the audience, it's time for you to make your way to your next session. Along the way, make sure you accept your connection request and take some time to check out our amazing exhibits. Thanks so much, and we'll see you around.
Thank you.